My name is Ethan Cole. I'm recording this from the 4th floor of an abandoned municipal building in Dayton. The generators downstairs are coughing again. Every few minutes the lights dim, then come back. I don't know how much longer they'll last. I'm going to speak slowly. I'm going to stay factual. They are not vampires. That word has already done too much damage. They don't come from folklore. They don't obey myths. There is nothing supernatural happening here. They are infected humans. Whatever you've seen online. Whatever clips are still circulating on dead networks. Whatever people are whispering about in shelters. This is biology. This is a parasitic organism engineered to alter human metabolism, cognition, and behavior. Turns people into predators. Night is when they hunt. Daylight is when you survive. That rule has not failed yet. 3 weeks ago, I was still reading traffic reports and school closure announcements. I was still arguing with producers about ad slots. I was still drinking burnt coffee from a paper cup and worrying about ratings. The first alert came in as a medical bulletin from Riverside County. Clusters of patients arriving with violent delirium, acute light sensitivity, tachycardia, and compulsive biting. The preliminary diagnosis was stimulant psychosis, then hemorrhagic fever, then some kind of mass hysteria tied to an unknown drug. They restrained patients, sedated them, started 4 lines. 2 nurses were bitten during intake. One of them bled out on the tile floor before anyone could get compression on the wound. By that afternoon, phone footage was everywhere. A man in a hospital gown tearing open a blood refrigerator. Another crawling through ceiling panels. A woman screaming because her brother couldn't stand the overhead lights. Authorities called it civil unrest. We called it isolated incidents. I repeated the official statements on air and told people to stay calm. I regret that. What we didn't understand at first was the speed. The parasite doesn't just infect. It rewrites. It increases oxygen consumption to catastrophic levels. It accelerates adrenal output. It pushes hematocrit through the roof, then burns through red cells faster than the body can replenish them. The infected begin to suffocate internally. They don't crave blood for symbolic reasons. They need it to survive. Without external iron and oxygen carriers, they collapse. So they bite. Hospitals were the first to fall. Blood banks became targets within hours. Emergency departments became slaughterhouses. I remember speaking to a lab technician from Mercy General. She had barricaded herself inside pathology with 3 interns. She told me they could hear 4 poles scraping down the hallway. She said one of the surgeons had locked himself inside a supply closet and started cutting open plasma bags with a scalpel. Her line went dead mid-sentence. The first city didn't collapse loudly. San Bernardino just stopped answering. Dispatch went silent. Police radios dropped 1 precinct at a time. Traffic cameras showed abandoned cars and open doors. By the next morning, smoke was rising from residential blocks. We still didn't call it what it was. We said communications outage. We said infrastructure failure. Underground spaces came next. Storm drains, parking garages, utility corridors, subway tunnels. Anywhere dark, anywhere cool, anywhere sound didn't travel well. Sanitation workers started reporting clusters of bodies pressed together in maintenance shafts. Transit crews found groups of infected packed into service tunnels, sharing blood from open wounds, breathing in rhythm. They weren't thrashing. They weren't screaming. They were conserving energy. They were waiting. I'm looking out the cracked window right now. Main Street is empty. There's dust in the air from somewhere south of here. The courthouse steps are spray-painted with stay and light, but the sun has already started to slide behind the buildings. No traffic, no birds, just wind pushing wrappers down the sidewalk. The daylight rule didn't come from scientists. It came from survivors. A firefighter in Bakersfield noticed the infected wouldn't cross open intersections at noon. A teacher in Phoenix dragged her class onto a rooftop and survived 2 days because the stairwell filled with sunlight. Body cam footage showed responders retreating into a parking lot, while a dozen infected stopped at the shadow line, shielding their eyes and twitching. Light doesn't kill them. It disrupts them. Extended exposure causes cellular breakdown and disorientation. Their pupils constrict. Their coordination collapses. At night, all of that reverses. At night, they move fast. At night, they organize. The government response arrived in stages. First curfews, then National Guard deployments, then aerial announcements telling people to shelter in place. They sealed counties, then regions, then borders. It didn't matter. You can't quarantine something that rides in ambulances and evacuation buses. You can't contain panic. Dallas tried martial law. Armored vehicles at intersections. Soldiers handing out water and printed instructions. 2 hours later, someone drove a delivery truck through a barricade. The driver was infected. His blood sprayed across 4 troops. By morning, the checkpoint was empty. We began sharing survival rules over open frequencies. Travel only in daylight. Stay silent at night. Cover windows. Avoid underground spaces. If someone is bitten, you have minutes, not hours. There is no antivenom. There is no vaccine. Once the parasite reaches the brainstem, motor control and empathy shut down in rapid succession. I know that because a virologist called in from Baltimore before their grid went dark. She told me the organism carried synthetic markers, lab-built protein chains designed to bypass immune response and hijack adrenal systems. She said this wasn't an accident. She said someone made it. We lost Cleveland on Friday, then St. Louis, then parts of Toronto. Reports started filtering in from overseas, but verification became impossible once satellites began dropping offline. People stopped flying. People drove. People walked. Families crossed cornfields and rail yards carrying children wrapped in towels. I stayed because the building had generators and antennas and someone needed to keep talking. I dragged filing cabinets across stairwells, jammed desks against doors. I sleep in 20-minute blocks with a headlamp clipped to my collar. 2 nights ago, they found this building. I was recording a looped weather update when the glass started vibrating. Not breaking, just humming. Low frequency. I killed the lights and crawled under the broadcast desk. I could hear nails clicking on concrete outside. Wet breathing. Someone pounding on the lobby doors hard enough to rattle the frames. Then a fire alarm went off across the street. Red strobes washed through the windows. They screamed, not in pain, more like pressure being released. They scattered into alleys and stairwells, back into shadow. That's when I fully understood. Light drives them away. Yesterday morning, a man named Carl reached the front steps with a portable radio and a shattered leg. He said his wife was in the car. He said she'd been bitten 2 days earlier and he was trying to keep her awake. He asked if I had any lights strong enough to help. I told him to bring her inside. She was lucid when they came through the lobby. She apologized while she attacked him. I locked the inner door and listened to him die. I buried Carl in the courtyard with a shovel from maintenance. I didn't bury her. There are armed groups now. Neighborhood militias. People shooting anything that moves. There are also others. I intercepted a transmission this morning from a group calling themselves the Ascended. They believe infection is evolution. They are letting themselves be bitten. They are walking into tunnels together. Human survivors are becoming a secondary threat. The sun is slipping lower. I've moved into the interior hallway. The windows are covered. The generator is stalling again. If you are still alive and moving in daylight, remember this. Do not trust familiar voices in the dark. Do not assume symptoms will announce themselves. If someone tells you they feel better at night, they are already gone. This didn't come from myth. It didn't come from nature. It came from a lab. And now it's everywhere. I'm staying on the air as long as I can. The light is fading. The generator finally stabilized around midnight. Not smoothly. It coughed, surged, dropped voltage twice, then settled into a low mechanical growl that vibrated through the concrete floors. I sat with my back against a filing cabinet and counted breaths until my hands stopped shaking. Night changes everything. During the day, the city feels abandoned. At night, it feels occupied. You can hear them moving. Not constantly, not loudly, comes in waves. Footsteps scraping across asphalt. Something metallic being dragged. A distant thud, followed by silence. Sometimes a burst of sound, like furniture being overturned inside a storefront. They don't scream unless light hits them. Most of the time, they hunt quietly. I learned that the hard way on the third night after Dayton started losing power. I'd gone down to the second floor to refill water from a gravity tank I'd rigged in the old records room. I kept my headlamp off and moved by memory, counting doorways, tracing the wall with my fingertips. Halfway back to the stairwell, I heard breathing. Not close, but not far. Wet, rhythmic. I froze. The hallway was dark, but moonlight spilled through a broken window at the far end. In that narrow silver strip, I saw movement. A shoulder, then a face. The eyes reflected just enough to tell me it was watching. I didn't run. Running makes noise. I slowly unclipped the flashlight from my collar and rolled it down the hall. When it hit the wall and turned, the beam flared. The figure recoiled like it had been struck. It hissed. Not animal. Human vocal cords forced into something else. I backed away, one step at a time, until my calves touched the stairwell door. I didn't breathe until I was back upstairs. That's how close it is now. All the time, people keep asking, through whatever channels still work, how to tell if someone is infected. There isn't a single sign. It starts with headaches and light sensitivity, then elevated heart rate, then compulsive thirst. By the time you see behavioral changes, the parasite is already threading through the nervous system. Some people become violent immediately. Others stay lucid for hours, sometimes days. They can talk. They can cry. They can apologize. It doesn't matter. Once the organism reaches the brainstem, empathy collapses. Inhibitory signals shut down. The adrenal glands are forced into permanent overdrive. They don't feel fear. They don't feel fatigue. They feel hunger. We tried treating it. That's the part no one wants to talk about. Emergency wards experimented with antivirals, broad-spectrum antibiotics, antiparasitics meant for livestock, blood transfusions, oxygen chambers. Nothing slowed it. One hospital in Columbus attempted full-body UV exposure. The patients convulsed until their muscles tore. The parasite adapted within hours. A research team in Chicago tried targeted CRISPR disruption on extracted samples. They were overrun before the second trial finished. We lost the medical system in under 10 days. What remains are scattered clinics run by volunteers with flashlights and duct tape. I started receiving fragments of intercepted communications around that time. Encrypted research logs, partial emails, audio memos from labs that no longer exist. The organism didn't originate overseas. It didn't come from wildlife. It was built here, an illegal biomedical startup operating under a shell company tied to defense contracting. Their stated goal was regenerative enhancement, rapid clotting, accelerated healing, battlefield survivability. They achieved it, just not the way they planned. The parasite increases red cell production briefly, then consumes it exponentially. It forces angiogenesis, grows new capillaries, then uses them as distribution lines. It floods the system with catecholamines and strips away higher cognitive function. They were trying to make soldiers who didn't feel pain. They made predators who can't stop. There are stages. I pieced that together from scattered survivor testimony and one recorded interview with a postdoc who made it out of Denver. Stage 1 is exposure. Bites. Blood contact with mucous membranes. Open wounds. Stage 2 is metabolic acceleration. Fever. Photosensitivity. Auditory distortion. Stage 3 is behavioral shift. Irritability. Obsession with fluid intake. Compulsive jaw movement. Stage 4 is loss of executive function. After that, there's no coming back. I keep thinking about a family from outside Springfield who called in 3 days ago. They were sheltering in a church basement with their teenage daughter. She'd been bitten on the forearm while helping a neighbor. They wrapped it in towels soaked in alcohol. They held flashlights on her skin. They begged me to tell them what to do. She was still herself when they spoke. She asked if school would start again. Her mother kept apologizing for putting her on the phone. They wanted to sedate her. They wanted to restrain her. They wanted to know if cutting off the arm would help. I told them the truth. It was already systemic. They stayed on the line for another hour while her breathing changed. Her father kept saying her name. Then there was a sound like furniture falling over. The line went dead. I don't know what they chose. I know what usually happens. People think this is fast. It isn't. Collapse takes time. First utilities fail. Then supply chains. Then trust. Food becomes currency. Batteries become treasure. People start guarding doorways with rifles and homemade spears. Some communities hold together for a while. Shared watch rotations. Signal mirrors on rooftops. Chalk markings on sidewalks to indicate safe paths. Others fracture immediately. I've heard gunfire more in the last week than in my entire life. Not defensive fire. Arguments. Territory. Desperation. There are recordings circulating now of groups dragging infected into sunlight and filming their breakdown. There are others showing survivors tied to chairs and interrogated because someone thought they were hiding bites. We're eating each other alive. Last night, I heard singing from 3 blocks away, carried through the empty streets. A dozen voices, maybe more. They weren't infected. They were people. They sang until the screams started. I don't know what happened to them. I didn't go to look. The parasite isn't the only thing killing us anymore. There are cult cells operating in multiple cities. They believe the infected are a higher form. They talk about shedding daylight. They smear blood on their faces and walk into tunnels. Some of them come back. Most don't. The infected population is growing faster than we can count. But they aren't immortal. Extended exposure to sunlight degrades their tissues. Their muscles begin to necrose. Their coordination collapses over weeks if they can't stay in darkness. They burn out. That part is real. The problem is whether anyone is left when that happens. I lost 2 companions yesterday, Mara and Ben. They'd been running supplies between buildings at noon, using reflective panels to keep streets washed in light. They made it halfway back when a group of armed survivors stepped out from behind a delivery truck. They wanted the batteries. Ben tried to explain. Someone fired. Mara went down. The infected heard the noise. By the time I reached the window with a spotlight, it was already over. I buried what I could retrieve in the courtyard next to Carl. There isn't room for markers anymore. Just shallow ground and silence. The broadcasts from other cities are thinning. Atlanta went quiet this morning. So did Seattle. I don't know how much longer this relay will hold. I keep recording because that's the only thing I still know how to do. If anyone ever finds these logs, I want them to understand something. This wasn't a curse. This wasn't divine punishment. This was human ambition running faster than ethics. The sun will be up in a few hours. I'll move then. I've mapped a route along open rooftops toward the river. There's a chance the water treatment plant still has solar panels online. I'll carry what I can. I'll leave the rest. Night is thinning. I can feel it. They're quieter when dawn is close. I'm packing now. My hands are steady. That feels important. I made it to the river at first light. The rooftops were slick with condensation, and the metal HVAC housings were cold enough to sting through my gloves. I moved slowly, staying in open stretches, stepping only where the sun had already touched. Every shadow felt like a doorway. They were still out there. You can always tell by the smell. There's copper and rot and something sweet underneath like spoiled fruit. I crossed 3 buildings before I saw the first one. It was crouched beneath a collapsed billboard frame on 3rd Avenue. Body pulled tight against itself, skin pale and blistered from partial exposure. Its jaw worked rhythmically, grinding teeth against nothing. When the sunlight crept farther across the pavement, it twitched and dragged itself backward into the shade, leaving a dark smear behind. They learn. That's what keeps me awake. They learn where the light reaches. They learn how long they can tolerate it. They learn our patterns. The water treatment plant was already breached when I arrived. The front gates had been torn open, not forced with tools but bent outward, metal fatigued by repeated impact. Inside, the control room windows were shattered, and the emergency battery backups were gone. Someone had looted the place. Someone else had died trying to stop them. There was blood on the stair rails and long drag marks leading toward the filtration tunnels. I didn't go underground. I scavenged what I could from the maintenance shed. Portable inverter, 2 solar chargers, a box of nitrile gloves, 3 unopened bottles of iodine. On the wall, someone had written "Light is law" in permanent marker. I sat in the shade of a chlorine tank and drank half a liter of treated water, forcing myself to swallow slowly so I wouldn't vomit. That's when I heard the child. She was calling for her mother. Not crying, just calling. Softly. That kind of sound travels. I moved toward it despite myself. She was about 8, maybe 9, sitting on the concrete steps behind the administration wing. Her legs were tucked under her, hands folded in her lap like she'd been told to wait there. Her face was streaked with dirt. Her eyes tracked the sun as it shifted. She asked if I had seen her mom. I asked if she was hurt. She shook her head. I asked if anyone had bitten her. She lifted her sleeve without being prompted. Her arm was clean. I gave her a protein bar and told her to eat slowly. She said they were trying to get to the river when her mother fell. She said the men with guns wouldn't help. She said her mom told her to stay where the light was. That part was done right. I took her with me. We moved along the levee, staying in open ground, avoiding culverts and underpasses. I wrapped her in my jacket when the wind picked up. She didn't complain. Her name was Ava. She asked if the schools would open again. I told her I didn't know. By mid-morning, smoke was rising from the east side of the city. Something industrial finally giving up. The plumes spread low and wide, muting the sky. We found shelter in a loading bay with a collapsed roof that let sunlight spill through in wide bands. I set up the solar chargers and handed Ava one of the iodine bottles to hold. She asked if it was medicine. I told her it helped keep water safe. She nodded like that made sense. While she slept, I listened to recordings I downloaded from a dead repeater tower. One was from a research assistant who'd been part of the original project. He sounded exhausted. He said the parasite had been designed with a kill switch, a protein cascade that could be triggered chemically to induce apoptosis. He said the switch never worked in vivo. He said the organism rewrote itself faster than they could target it. He said when containment failed, management ordered the lab wiped. The samples weren't destroyed. They were taken. There was another file from a field medic outside Kansas City. He described infected clustering under highway overpasses, stacking bodies 3 deep to avoid sunlight. He said they'd started using debris to block light sources. He said they were learning to disable generators by following vibration. That one made me turn off my equipment for an hour. We left the loading bay in the early afternoon and headed north, following a rail line that ran through open scrubland. Ava held my hand when we crossed exposed stretches. She flinched at every distant noise. I showed her how to walk in my footsteps. We passed 3 burned-out cars and a grocery truck overturned in a ditch. Someone had spray-painted "NO more blood" on the trailer door. Near mile marker 14, we found a group of survivors camped in a solar array field. They had mirrors rigged on poles and battery-powered floodlights pointed outward. They'd marked their perimeter with reflective tape. They were organized. They were tired. They let us in after checking Ava's arms and neck. There were 12 of them. A former electrician named Paul had taken charge. They had ration plans, watch rotations, and a map of daylight-safe corridors drawn in chalk on a piece of plywood. They told me Chicago was gone. They told me the coastlines were evacuating inland, and the inland cities were collapsing outward. They told me Europe was worse. They had lost 4 people the night before when a cult group tried to breach their lights. Paul said the cultists were singing. They stayed with us until sunset. At dusk, the infected began to appear at the edge of the field. Not charging, observing. They kept to the shadows of the distant trees, pacing in loose arcs. One of them was wearing a police uniform. Another still had a backpack on. Ava pressed her face into my side. The floodlights held them back, but the generator sputtered every few minutes, and every sputter brought them closer. Paul made the call to move. We split into pairs and headed west toward a quarry where the ground stayed exposed. Halfway there, someone tripped over loose gravel. The sound was small. It was enough. They came out of the tree line like water breaking through a dam. We ran. I don't remember most of it. I remember dragging Ava over a concrete barrier. I remember Paul firing until his rifle clicked empty. I remember a woman screaming that her husband was down. I remember the smell. We made it to the quarry with 7 people. The rest didn't follow. We sealed ourselves inside an equipment shed and burned magnesium flares until morning. Paul didn't survive the night. He'd been bitten during the sprint. He tied himself to a forklift and told us to keep Ava away while it happened. He stayed lucid for nearly an hour. He asked if anyone would remember his name. I told him I would. By sunrise, his eyes were already changing. We left him there. There is no ceremony anymore. Only motion. The infected are everywhere now. They outnumber us in most urban zones. They move through sewer systems and service tunnels, emerging at dusk like tidewater. They're not coordinated in the way armies are coordinated. They're coordinated in the way ants are. Pressure and response. Stimulus and adaptation. Human survivors are splintering into armed enclaves and wandering caravans. Some trade. Some raid. Some don't let anyone near them. I've seen people executed over bottled water. I've seen families turned away from fortified grocery stores because they couldn't prove they weren't bitten. Ava doesn't ask many questions anymore. She counts steps. She watches the sky. She sleeps with one hand on my sleeve. We're heading toward farmland now. Open ground. Wide horizons. If the sun holds, we can keep moving. If it doesn't, we'll find another place to wait. The parasite will eventually burn itself out. The tissues degrade. The nervous system collapses. That's what the models say. But models don't account for how much of humanity gets eaten before that happens. I keep recording because memory is the only resistance I have left. If this reaches anyone, know this. We did this to ourselves. Not with malice. With ambition. And we didn't stop when we should have. The light is strong right now. Ava is walking beside me. Her shadow is long on the gravel. I'm still moving. As long as that's true, I'll keep talking. We left the quarry just after noon. The air over the fields was heavy with heat and dust, and the horizon blurred into a pale smear where the sky met the corn. Ava walked quietly beside me, counting fence posts under her breath. Every few minutes she glanced up, checking the sun's position like she'd learned to do instinctively. That's what this has become. Children learning solar angles instead of math. The farmland was mostly empty. Tractors sat abandoned in rows. Irrigation lines hissed weakly from broken valves. A farmhouse 2 miles in had its doors ripped off and dark stains leading into the barn. We didn't stop. I don't let Ava near enclosed spaces anymore unless I can see daylight on both sides. We followed a drainage canal that had dried down to cracked clay. The open corridor kept us exposed but safe. Every shadow from the cottonwoods felt like a gamble. I started hearing helicopters again around mid-afternoon. Not close. High altitude. Probably military. They don't land anymore. They drop pallets and leave. We found one of those drops outside a grain co-op. MREs, water purification tabs, trauma kits, and printed cards with evacuation coordinates that were already obsolete. Someone had already been there. Most of the food was gone. They left behind a roll of gauze and a bloodied tourniquet. I took the trauma kit. Ava found a juice box and drank it slowly, savoring it. She asked if airplanes still existed. I told her some probably did. She nodded and went back to watching the clouds. By evening, we reached a cluster of storage silos with reflective metal sides. The sun bounced off them hard enough to make my eyes ache. We set up on the concrete apron between 2 towers where light pooled until nearly dusk. I used iodine to treat canal water. Ava lined up rocks in a neat row and pretended they were houses. She named them. I didn't ask why. Nightfall came quietly. It always does. There's a moment when the light just drains out of the world, like someone turning down a dimmer switch. That's when you hear the first movement. Something shifting in tall grass. A distant clatter. A low vocalization that could almost be mistaken for wind. I set up the inverter and pointed both floodlights toward the tree line. The batteries were at 60%. Not great. Ava sat with her back against the silo wall and held the flashlight I'd given her, aiming it at the ground like she'd been taught. They didn't rush us this time. They watched. I could see shapes between the corn rows. Heads tilting. Bodies swaying. One stepped forward into the light and recoiled, baring teeth stained dark. Another tried to approach from the left, staying low, testing the edge of illumination. They're careful now. They probe. I kept the light steady and talked to Ava about her favorite cartoons. She told me about a dog that could fly. Around midnight, one of the batteries failed. The left floodlight dimmed, then went out. They surged forward immediately, not running, advancing. I fired a flare into the field. The burst of white light scattered them back for a few seconds, long enough for me to swap power leads and reroute the inverter. The light came back on. My hands were shaking too badly to feel the connectors. They stayed just beyond the glow until dawn. At first light, they retreated into the corn. I didn't sleep. We moved again. There was a town 12 miles north that still showed intermittent power on my handheld scanner. We reached it by late morning. Most of the storefronts were burned. Someone had built barricades out of shopping carts and plywood. There were bodies in the intersection, covered with tarps weighted down by bricks. We were stopped by two men with rifles before we reached the center. They made us lift our sleeves. They checked Ava's neck. They searched my pack. They let us through. Inside, maybe 30 people were sheltering in what used to be a hardware store. Solar panels lined the roof. Mirrors hung from streetlights, angled to flood the road with reflected sunlight. They had a clinic set up in the garden center. A former pediatric nurse named Elaine was running it with 3 volunteers. She examined Ava with gentle hands and told me she looked healthy. She didn't ask how long we'd been on the road. She didn't need to. They had a radio rig, too. Not powerful, but enough to pull in fragments of international broadcasts. Brazil had fallen. Parts of India were burning. Eastern Europe was fragmenting into isolated enclaves. Ports were closed. Shipping lanes were dead. No one was coordinating anymore, just reacting. That afternoon, Elaine told me about a man they'd tried to save 2 days earlier. He'd been bitten on the calf. They amputated within 30 minutes. He stayed lucid for almost 4 hours. Long enough to call his sister. Long enough to ask for painkillers. The parasite had already moved past the wound site. They sedated him and kept him in a sunlit room until his breathing changed. Then they moved him outside. Elaine said she'd never forgive herself for the way he looked at her. Ava sat on a stack of paint cans and colored with a marker someone found in the office. She drew a house with a big sun over it. I stayed in the town for 1 night. That was a mistake. A convoy arrived just before dusk. 3 trucks, heavy armor, private security markings. They demanded fuel and batteries. The town council tried to negotiate. Someone fired a warning shot. The infected heard it from wherever they were hiding. They poured out of storm drains and crawl spaces. The convoy fled. The town burned. I grabbed Ava and ran through back alleys lit by burning trash bins. We didn't stop until the smoke thinned and the screaming faded. We slept in an open field under the stars. She dreamed and called for her mother. Couldn't wake her. There are rumors now of survivor cities in the Rockies. High altitude, thin air, wide sunlight exposure. I don't know if they're real. I know the highways are clogged with abandoned vehicles and bones. The parasite is everywhere. The cult groups are spreading. Some survivors have started marking themselves with paint to look infected and move through clusters unnoticed. It works sometimes. Sometimes it gets them torn apart. I don't carry weapons anymore. They draw attention. I carry light. I carry water. I carry Ava. I don't talk about the future. I talk about the next open space, the next patch of sun, the next place we can breathe. The models say the infected population will peak within months. They say tissue degradation will reduce mobility. They say daylight exposure will finish what starvation starts. They don't model children. They don't model trauma. They don't model what happens when millions of people lose everything at once. Ava asked me today if her mother would find us. I told her we'd leave signs. She accepted that. We're heading west again. The land opens up that way. I can see storms building in the distance. Cloud cover is dangerous. Night is worse. The storm reached us before sunset. It rolled in low and fast, flattening the tall grass and pulling the temperature down in minutes. The clouds swallowed the sky in layers, turning late afternoon into something that felt like early evening. Ava watched the light fade and tightened her grip on my sleeve. Cloud cover changes the rules. They don't need full darkness. They only need shadows. We were crossing an open stretch of highway when the wind picked up hard enough to push grit into our eyes. Abandoned cars were scattered along both shoulders, doors hanging open, luggage spilled across asphalt. Someone had tried to burn a mattress in the median. The smoke clung to the ground. I could already hear movement under the overpass ahead. I changed direction immediately, pulling Ava toward a drainage field where broken pavement gave way to scrub and weeds. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. She ran when I ran. Rain started in heavy, warm sheets. The world went gray. I held the flashlight out in front of us, sweeping it in wide arcs to keep the ground illuminated. Every time the beam hit tall grass, something shifted inside it. They were moving with the weather. The storm gave them cover. We reached a livestock corral just as the first of them broke from the weeds. I slammed the gate shut behind us and dragged a rusted feed trough across it. Ava climbed onto a concrete divider while I kicked over a portable floodlight someone had left behind. The battery still had charge. The beam flared on, washing the pen in harsh white. They recoiled as one. Rain plastered their hair to their faces. Their clothes hung off them in wet strips. One of them still had hospital wristbands on both arms. They circled the fence, testing weak points, hands scraping along the wire. I kept the light moving. Ava crouched behind me and pressed her hands over her ears. They stayed with us for nearly 2 hours. Not attacking. Waiting. I could feel my calves cramping from holding position. When the storm finally passed and the clouds began to break, they retreated into the fields, slipping back into cover like they'd never been there. We didn't sleep. We moved as soon as the sun burned through. The corral led into open ranchland, then into low hills dotted with wind turbines. Some were still turning slowly, blades groaning in the breeze. We followed the ridgeline until midday, then descended into a valley where a small settlement had formed around a solar farm. They had tents stretched between panel arrays and reflective tarps hung from poles. Their perimeter was marked with white paint and broken mirrors. They waved us in without raising weapons. There were about 50 people. Families, older couples, a few teenagers who moved like they'd aged 10 years in a month. They were growing vegetables in raised beds made from shipping pallets. Someone had built a still for ethanol. Someone else was teaching kids how to clean wounds with boiled water. Felt fragile, like a soap bubble. A former epidemiologist named Harris had become their unofficial coordinator. He recognized my voice from earlier broadcasts and asked me what I'd seen. I told him the truth, that cities were gone, that organized response had collapsed, that whatever remained of government was airborne and distant. He nodded like he already knew. He said they'd been tracking infected behavior patterns. He said clusters were forming along migratory corridors, rivers, rail lines, highway arteries. He said they were seeing signs of adaptive shelter building, makeshift barricades made from trash and furniture to block light at tunnel mouths. He said it wasn't random anymore. They let us stay one night. That was all they could afford. Food was rationed by the gram, water by the cup. That evening, Harris showed me a map covered in pencil marks. Every mark was a reported nest. Every line was a known daylight-safe route. The map was already outdated. He told me they'd intercepted a transmission from a biotech facility in Utah. Survivors had breached a secure archive and pulled internal documents. The parasite wasn't just engineered. It had been tested. Small-scale trials on incarcerated volunteers. Early versions caused massive hemorrhaging. Later iterations stabilized. The final strain showed near-perfect compliance with host motor systems. The project had been funded through a defense subcontract buried under disaster preparedness grants. There were signatures. There were approvals. There were emails warning about containment. They went forward anyway. Ava slept curled against my side on a cot between two solar inverters. I didn't sleep. I listened to the wind move through the panels. I listened for footsteps. At dawn, a caravan arrived from the south. 3 pickup trucks and a school bus painted white. They carried wounded. One man had lost an eye. Another had a bite on his shoulder that they were pretending not to see. They wanted supplies. Harris said no. They tried to force the issue. Someone fired into the air. The infected came from the tree line like they'd been waiting for a cue. The settlement scattered. I grabbed Ava and ran uphill toward the turbines. Behind us, I heard screaming. I didn't look back. We reached the ridge and kept going. The land rose into open plateau. The air got thinner. The sun stayed stronger longer. We're heading toward the mountains now. I don't know what we'll find there. I know what we're leaving behind. The infected are outnumbering survivors in most regions. Cult groups are spreading through evacuation routes, infecting people deliberately. Armed enclaves are shooting first and asking questions never. There is no centralized authority. There is no rescue coming. The parasite will burn itself out eventually. The models still say that. But models don't account for famine. They don't account for winter. They don't account for what happens when children grow up learning that darkness means death. Ava asked me today why people made the sickness. I told her they were trying to help. She thought about that for a long time. Then she said they should have stopped. She's right. We all should have. The light is still good. We're above the valley now. I can see snow on distant peaks. If there's anywhere left where they can't hide, it's there. I don't know if we'll make it. I know we'll try. As long as the sun stays with us, we keep walking. The road narrowed into cracked switchbacks, then faded into gravel, then into nothing at all. We followed an old fire access trail marked by rusted posts and half-buried reflectors. The air thinned fast. Every breath felt sharper. Ava developed a nosebleed halfway up. I tilted her head forward and pinched the bridge of her nose until it stopped. She didn't complain. She just watched the blood soak into the dust. Altitude slows them. That's one of the few advantages we have. Their altered metabolism demands oxygen. At higher elevations, they fatigue faster. Their coordination degrades. They become sloppy. It doesn't stop them. It buys time. By midday, we reached a plateau with scrub pine and scattered boulders. Someone had built a crude shelter out of tarp and driftwood near a solar weather station. Inside, we found empty food wrappers, a child's sock, and a journal written in pencil. The last entry said, "They followed us into the trees. We tried to keep the light on them, but the batteries died. If anyone finds this, tell my sister I'm sorry." There was no name. We buried the journal under rocks. We kept moving. Around 2 in the afternoon, we heard gunfire echoing through the valley below. Short bursts, then silence. I didn't change course. We crossed a dried stream bed and climbed into open alpine grassland. The sun was brutal up here. There was nowhere to hide from it. Ava squinted and walked with her head down, counting steps again. She told me she was tired. I told her we'd rest when we reached the next ridge. She believed me. We crested that ridge just before evening and saw the compound. It had been a ski resort once. Chairlift towers still stood against the sky, cables sagging between them. The main lodge had solar panels bolted across its roof and reflective sheeting draped over the balconies. A wide perimeter of mirrored fencing had been erected around the lower buildings. Light flooded the entire courtyard. People were moving inside. Real people. I didn't cry. I just stopped walking for a moment and let Ava lean into me. They spotted us almost immediately. Two figures approached through the light field, rifles slung but not raised. They checked our arms. They checked Ava's neck. They waved us through. There were maybe 80 survivors inside the perimeter. Doctors, former park rangers, families who'd made it up from the valleys. They had wind turbines feeding battery banks. They had grow tents inside the old rental shop. They had a water purification system running off melted snow. They had order. It was the first place I'd seen that felt intentional. A woman named Dr. Kwan was overseeing medical triage. She examined Ava carefully, checked her oxygen saturation, and gave her a packet of dried fruit. She told me they'd been tracking infected migration routes. She told me altitude had slowed spread in the Rockies, Andes, and parts of the Himalayas. She told me isolated mountain communities were holding longer than cities ever did. She also told me they were running out of antibiotics. She asked if I had medical training. I told her I had broadcast training. She smiled tiredly and said that might be just as useful. They let us stay. They put Ava in a room with 3 other children and gave me a cot in what used to be a conference center. That night, I slept for 4 hours straight. Felt unreal. The compound had rules. Lights on at dusk. No underground access. No one moves alone. Any bite is reported immediately. Anyone infected is isolated in the East Wing where sunlight pours through floor-to-ceiling glass. No restraints. No sedation. Just light. I asked Dr. Kwan how many they'd lost. She said 27. Most of them during the first week before they understood how fast it spread. She said they'd stopped counting burials individually. They cremate now. The ash goes into the snow. On the 3rd day, a group arrived from the south. They brought news that Denver was fully overrun. They brought 2 wounded and 1 infected teenager. The boy's name was Marcus. He'd been bitten on the thigh while helping his uncle load supplies. They'd amputated in the field. It hadn't helped. Marcus stayed lucid for nearly 6 hours. He asked for his phone. He asked if he could see the stars. Dr. Kwan walked him into the East Wing and sat with him until the end. Ava drew him a picture before they took him away. She left it on his bed. I watched through the glass as his hands began to shake. I watched his pupils dilate. I watched the parasite take what was left. There are no miracles here. Only management. Only delay. The compound intercepts transmissions when they can. They're piecing together a global picture. South America is fragmented. Africa is largely dark. Asia is burning through coastal megacities. Europe has scattered highland enclaves. The infected population is peaking in urban corridors and river deltas. The cult groups are spreading faster than the parasite in some regions. They call themselves different things. They all believe the same lie, that surrender is transcendence. Human survivors are now killing each other over solar panels. That part hurts more than I expected. Ava is adjusting. She helps in the greenhouse. She learned how to purify water. She laughs sometimes with the other kids. Then she goes quiet for hours. At night, she asks if I think her mother would be proud of her. I tell her yes. I don't know if that's true. I just know it's necessary. Dr. Kwan showed me data from a group in Nepal. High-altitude infected are degrading faster. Muscle necrosis within weeks. Neural breakdown shortly after. They collapse in the open and don't get back up. The parasite burns out when it can't hide from the sun. That part is real. The question is how many humans survive long enough to see it. Supplies are finite. Seeds are limited. Winter is coming. And even here, at the edge of the sky, people are starting to argue about who gets to stay. The compound voted yesterday to close intake. They can't support more mouths. I didn't speak. I understood. That's the kind of choice this world makes now. I've started recording again from a quiet corner of the lodge. Not for broadcast. For record. If someone finds these files someday, I want them to know that we tried. Not everyone, but enough. The sun is setting over the peaks. The light holds longer up here. That's a mercy. Ava is asleep. I'm sitting by the window, watching shadows stretch across snow. The infected are somewhere below us, moving through forests and valleys, adapting to every mistake we make. They will reach this place eventually. Everything does. Until then, we breathe thin air and grow vegetables and teach children to follow the sun. And we wait. They reached the outer valleys a week later. Not in a wave, in threads. Small groups filtering upward along creek beds and hiking trails, moving at dawn and dusk, testing elevation limits the same way they test light. The first one was spotted near an abandoned ranger station 3 miles downslope. A drone caught it stumbling across scree, collapsing twice before it reached the tree line. Altitude was hurting them. That was the only reason we saw it coming. Dr. Kwan ordered additional mirrors installed along the southern ridge. Battery reserves were redistributed. Floodlights were repositioned to cover the service road. The compound shifted into siege posture without anyone needing to say the word. People stopped laughing. Everyone started counting watts. The infected didn't charge the perimeter. They watched. They gathered in shaded gullies and under rock overhangs. They dragged fallen branches and broken signs into crude barriers that cast deeper shadows. They learned which slopes lost light first. They were building shelter. That realization moved through the compound quietly. No one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. I started helping with communications again. The resort's old radio tower still had line of sight into 3 surrounding valleys. We scavenged antennas from snowcats and wired them into a patchwork relay. Every morning, I scanned emergency bands and recorded whatever fragments came through. There wasn't much left. A transmission from a monastery in Peru. A distress call from a cargo ship drifting off Iceland. A garbled message from someone in Siberia describing entire villages moving into caves. The pattern was the same everywhere. Cities emptied. High ground held. Lowlands drowned in bodies. The infected population was starting to plateau. Dr. Kwan showed me the charts. She'd been tracking degradation rates by region. Neural collapse after prolonged light exposure. Muscle atrophy. Failure of peripheral circulation. They were burning themselves out, but they were still dangerous, still hunting, still multiplying where survivors clustered. They don't need long-term viability to destroy everything. They only need momentum. Ava started school again. 3 hours a day in what used to be a ski rental room. 2 teachers rotating between 15 children. Lessons focused on reading, basic math, and survival skills. She learned how to calculate shadow length. She learned how to filter water through charcoal. She learned to identify early-stage symptoms. No one teaches spelling anymore. They teach observation. On the 9th night, a man tried to leave. He was in his 40s. Former construction supervisor. He'd arrived with his wife and son. His wife had been bitten 2 weeks earlier and moved into the East Wing. She'd been lucid until that afternoon. He couldn't watch the rest. He packed a backpack and tried to slip past the lower gate during shift change. They caught him halfway down the access road. He begged them to let him go. He said he'd rather die outside than wait for his kid to become an orphan. Dr. Kwan made the call. They brought him back. They sedated him. They told his son he'd gone to scout for supplies. That night, the boy cried until he vomited. No one corrected the lie. The infected made their first coordinated push 2 days later. They waited for heavy cloud cover. They came up the ravine in groups of 5 or 6, using fallen debris as mobile shade. They moved fast despite the slope, slipping between light patches, retreating whenever floodlights caught them. One reached the perimeter fence and began tearing at the mirrored panels. We drove it back with flares and concentrated beams. 2 others made it to the service road before collapsing. Their legs simply stopped responding. They dragged themselves with their arms until sunlight finished the job. We burned the bodies where they fell. The smoke hung in the thin air for hours. After that, everyone started carrying a flare. The cult group arrived at dusk on the 12th day. 6 of them, barefoot, faces painted with dried blood. They walked openly toward the gates, hands raised, chanting about release. They said they'd come to join us. They said they wanted to be bitten together. Dr. Kwan refused entry. They sat down in the road and waited. By morning, 3 had wandered off toward the shadows below. The other 3 stayed. They stood in the light until their skin blistered and their lips cracked. They sang until their voices failed. Then they lay down and stopped moving. We buried them at the edge of the tree line. Ava asked why they did that. I told her some people don't know how to live without believing in something bigger than themselves. She thought about that. Then she went back to drawing. We lost power on turbine 3 during a wind lull. Battery reserves dropped to 40%. Food stores were down to 3 weeks at current intake. Dr. Kwan called a council meeting. They debated ration cuts. They debated closing the gates permanently. They debated sending out scouting teams to find other highland enclaves. No one mentioned rescue. That word doesn't exist anymore. I volunteered to help with external recon. They needed someone who understood signals and terrain. They also needed people without immediate family ties inside the compound. I understood what that meant. I told Ava I was going to help find more safe places. She asked if she could come. I said not this time. She nodded. She's learned what that tone means. I left at first light with 2 others, carrying solar chargers, maps, and enough food for 4 days. From the ridge, I could see infected movement along the valley floor. They were slower now. Some collapsed mid-stride. Others crawled into shadow and didn't come back out. The parasite is reaching its limits. Humanity is reaching its own. We found 1 survivor camp 2 valleys over. They'd been overrun the night before. We found a notebook, a broken lantern, and 12 shallow graves. We didn't stay. On the 3rd day, one of my companions slipped on loose shale and broke her ankle. We couldn't carry her fast enough. She insisted we leave her in an open clearing with flares and water. She said she'd hold the light as long as she could. I didn't argue. I marked the coordinates and promised to tell Dr. Kwan. I don't know if that promise means anything. I made it back to the compound alone. They let me in. They asked about the others. I told them what I could. Ava hugged me hard enough to bruise. That night, I stood on the balcony and watched the infected in the distance, collapsing one by one in the pale mountain light. They're burning out. You can see it now. The question is whether we already burned with them. Winter clouds are forming over the peaks. Snow will reduce sunlight. Snow will give them cover. Every season belongs to them now. I keep recording because silence feels like surrender. Because if someone survives this, I want them to know how it really ended. Not with heroism. Not with a cure. With people counting batteries and teaching children where shadows fall. And waiting for the dark. Snow came early. Not a storm. Just a quiet dusting at first, settling into the cracks of solar panels and softening the edges of footprints along the perimeter. Cloud cover followed. Thin sheets of gray that dulled the sun and shortened the safe hours. Dr. Kwan adjusted the light schedules immediately. Floodlights stayed on longer. Power was rationed harder. The grow tents lost heat overnight, and half the lettuce crop went limp before morning. The infected responded to the change within days. They started moving earlier, not waiting for full dusk anymore. They tested the compound in small, coordinated pushes during overcast afternoons, advancing in staggered lines, retreating whenever light intensified, then probing again from another angle. They were learning to read the weather. They were learning to wait for clouds. We lost turbine 2 when ice built up on the blades and snapped a bearing. The remaining batteries dropped to 30%. Dr. Kwan called another council. This time the arguments were louder. Some wanted to evacuate east toward another high-altitude site reported in Wyoming. Some wanted to dig in and hope for clearer skies. Some wanted to preemptively strike infected clusters below the tree line with whatever explosives we could improvise. No one had enough data to make a right choice. They voted to stay. Barely. That night, the east wing filled again. An older woman from the greenhouse collapsed while harvesting spinach. She'd been bitten 3 days earlier and hidden it under long sleeves, hoping it would go away. She was still conscious when they brought her in. She kept apologizing for wasting supplies. Dr. Kwan held her hand until her breathing changed. Ava helped carry clean blankets afterward. She didn't cry. She hasn't cried in a long time. We started burning bodies farther from the compound to keep smoke from marking our location. Ash fell on the snow like dark pollen. The recon data coming in from other enclaves wasn't good. A settlement near Aspen went silent. A high-altitude community in Chile reported internal collapse after a power failure. A monastery in Nepal lost half its population during a prolonged cloud cycle. Light is everything. Without it, the rules break. The parasite doesn't need full darkness, just less. We intercepted a final research packet from a defunct lab in Vancouver. It contained updated projections. Infected viability was dropping globally. Neural degradation accelerating. Peripheral motor collapse increasing. They estimated 90% of infected would be non-functional within 6 months if exposed regularly to sunlight. But that same window predicted catastrophic human mortality due to famine, exposure, and violence. The parasite would burn out. Civilization already had. Dr. Kwan didn't show the charts to everyone. She showed them to me because she knew I'd keep recording. She said someone had to remember the real numbers. On the 23rd night, they breached the lower fence. A group of infected used a fallen pine to bridge a light gap near the maintenance road. They crawled over each other to stay in shadow, pushing bodies forward until 3 made it past the reflective panels. 1 reached the laundry building. We neutralized it with flares and concentrated beams, but not before it bit a volunteer named Miguel on the wrist. Miguel didn't fight isolation. He asked for his sister. She died weeks earlier. He didn't know that. He spent his last lucid hour telling stories about growing up near the ocean. Ava left him another drawing. The children have started a habit of that. They draw pictures for the dying. Houses, sons, dogs, things that don't exist anymore. Food ran out 2 days later. Not completely, but enough that ration cuts became unavoidable. Adults skipped meals. Kids got smaller portions. Dr. Kwan started trading medical supplies over radio channels for seed stock and dried grain. Some groups responded. Some tried to lure us into traps. There are survivors now who hunt other survivors. They use distress calls as bait. They wait in shadowed ravines with rifles and rope. I recorded one such transmission before shutting it down. A woman crying for help. The coordinates led to a burned convoy and no bodies. I didn't share that with Ava. The cult groups have started climbing. They believe altitude brings them closer to whatever they think waits on the other side. They don't last long in the cold, but they leave trails of blood and broken skin that attract infected from miles away. Every mistake echoes. We lost 3 more people during a supply run when fog rolled in unexpectedly. They were less than a kilometer from the gates. The infected came out of the trees silently. Only 1 made it back. He didn't speak for 2 days. Winter is settling into the valleys now. Snow cover reflects some light, but cloud systems linger longer over the peaks. The infected move under forest canopies and rock shelves. They dig shallow depressions in drifts and wait. They're slower, clumsier, but they only need 1 opening. Ava asked me yesterday what happens after they're all gone. I told her people will still have to find food. They'll still have to rebuild. They'll still have to decide how to treat each other. She nodded. Then she asked if there would be schools again. I didn't answer right away. I told her maybe. Felt dishonest. But she smiled anyway. Dr. Kwan is losing weight. So am I. Everyone is. The compound feels smaller every day. The air feels thinner. The nights feel longer. We are watching the infected burn themselves out across the slopes below us. Bodies collapsing in sunlight. Limbs stiffening in open fields. It should feel like progress. It feels like waiting for a forest fire to run out of trees. I keep recording because silence makes room for lies. Because someday someone will say this was inevitable. It wasn't. It was engineered, approved, funded, released, and now we're standing on a mountain rationing light. Ava is asleep beside the heater. Her breath fogs the window. Outside, shadows are creeping across the snow. They always do, and we keep counting the hours until morning. The heater failed at 3 in the morning. Not completely. Just enough that the temperature inside the lodge dropped below freezing before anyone noticed. I woke to Ava shivering against me, her teeth clicking softly. I wrapped both of us in a second blanket and carried her into the greenhouse, where residual heat from the grow lights kept the air a few degrees warmer. By the time maintenance got the unit running again, 2 elderly residents were already hypothermic. One didn't recover. We buried him in frozen ground behind the lift station at noon. There are no words spoken at burials anymore, just hands passing tools. The infected activity decreased noticeably after that. Not gone. Reduced. They're reaching the end of their metabolic window. You can see it in how they move. Their gait is uneven. Their coordination is off. Some collapse while trying to climb. Some wander into sunlight and don't react. Their nervous systems are failing. Dr. Kwan says the parasite is losing its grip on peripheral motor control. She says the synaptic pathways are degrading. She says what we're watching is biological exhaustion. But exhaustion doesn't mean safety. Cornered animals are still dangerous. So are starving humans. 2 men tried to steal from the food cache during the 3rd ration cut. They were caught. They said they had children who needed more. So did everyone else. The council voted to exile them. Dr. Kwan argued for supervised labor instead. She lost. They were escorted beyond the perimeter at dusk with a flashlight and half a day's water. They didn't make it far. We heard the sounds from the ridge. Ava didn't ask what they were. She already knows. The East Wing is empty now. Not because there are no new infections. Because we stopped bringing people in. There's no space. No power, no capacity. Anyone bitten outside the compound doesn't come back. That's a line no one thought they'd ever cross. We crossed it quietly. The last broadcast I intercepted from a coastal city came through 2 nights ago. A man describing streets filled with stalled ships and abandoned ferries. He said infected were climbing anchor chains. He said the water was black with fuel and ash. He signed off mid-sentence. Dr. Kwan has started planning for dispersal. Not evacuation. Dispersal. Small groups moving independently to reduce resource strain and avoid becoming a fixed target. She asked me if I'd take Ava east toward a rumored enclave in the Black Hills. I told her yes. I didn't tell Ava yet. I don't know how to explain that safety now means never staying anywhere too long. The compound held a final meeting this afternoon. People sat wrapped in coats, breath visible in the air. They divided remaining supplies. They assigned routes. They exchanged radio frequencies that probably won't work. There were hugs. There were apologies. There were promises no one could keep. Ava gave her drawings to the other children. She kept one. A house with a big sun over it. She folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. The infected below us are mostly motionless now. Scattered shapes on snow-covered slopes. Some still twitch. Some are already still. The parasite is burning itself out. That part is real. But we're burning too. Farms are empty. Power grids are shattered. Supply chains are memory. Even if every infected body fell tomorrow, there wouldn't be enough infrastructure left to carry humanity forward intact. Dr. Kwan told me that quietly while we packed medical kits. She said pandemics don't end with recovery. They end with whatever is left. We leave at first light. 3 groups. Different directions. Different chances. Ava is asleep again. I'm sitting beside her with my pack already on. Recording this into a handheld unit that may never be heard. If someone finds it, I want them to understand something simple. The world didn't end with fire or explosions. It ended with clinics running out of gloves. With parents teaching children how to measure shadows. With people voting to exile their neighbors because there wasn't enough food. With engineered cells outpacing human compassion. We caused this, not as monsters, as professionals, as committees, as people who signed off on risk assessments and moved on to the next project. The sun will be up soon. We'll walk until our legs give out or we find another open place to rest. The infected will finish collapsing in the valleys. Some humans will survive. Most won't. There is no cure coming. No reset. Only whatever small lives manage to persist between winters. I don't know how much longer I'll be able to record. The batteries are nearly gone. My voice is tired. Ava just shifted in her sleep and reached for my hand. I'm here. As long as I can be. We move at dawn. We left before sunrise. Not together. That was the hardest part. 3 groups, staggered by 10 minutes, moving in different directions to avoid drawing attention. No waving. No long goodbyes. Just quiet nods and people turning their backs on the last place that had felt almost safe. Ava held my hand and counted our steps again. The air was sharp enough to burn our lungs. Snow squeaked under our boots. Our breath rose in thin white plumes that vanished almost immediately. Dr. Kwan watched us go from the balcony, wrapped in 2 coats, her hair pulled back tight. She raised one hand. I raised mine back. I don't expect to see her again. We followed an old maintenance road that wound down through sparse pine and exposed rock. The sun climbed slowly, spilling light across the slopes in pale sheets. Below us, the valley was littered with dark shapes. Most of the infected were no longer moving. Some lay twisted against trees. Some were frozen mid-crawl, fingers buried in snow. A few still twitched when light touched them, but even that response was fading. The parasite was losing its war with physics. It needed darkness, heat, oxygen, and hosts. Up here, it had none of those, but there were still pockets. We saw 3 near a collapsed trail bridge, huddled together under a fallen tarp. They lifted their heads when we passed but didn't rise. Their muscles failed them. One tried to stand and simply tipped sideways. I didn't feel relief. I felt empty. By noon we reached lower elevation and the temperature climbed just enough to soften the snow. The terrain opened into scrubland and scattered boulders. I kept Ava in full sun whenever possible, guiding her around shadowed crevices and ravines. We passed a burned-out ranger station. Inside were canned goods, already raided, and a radio smashed against the wall. Someone had written we tried on the bathroom mirror. We camped that night in an open field surrounded by dead grass and reflective debris from a wrecked satellite dish. I angled the dish to bounce moonlight across our sleeping area. It wasn't much, but it was something. Ava asked if the bad people were all gone. I told her many were. She asked if that meant everything would be okay. I told her it meant tomorrow would probably be quieter. She accepted that answer. That's how children survive this. They stop asking for guarantees. The second day, we encountered other survivors. For adults and a teenage boy pulling a wagon made from shopping cart parts. They were armed with hunting rifles and crowbars. Their faces were drawn tight with exhaustion. They asked for water. I gave them 2 bottles. They asked where we were headed. I said east. They said they'd heard of a place with working wells and wind power. No one knew where exactly. That's how rumors work now. They travel faster than people. We walked together for a while. Then they turned south. No one promised to stay in touch. By late afternoon, clouds began stacking on the horizon. I pushed Ava harder. She didn't complain. We found shelter in the skeletal remains of a drive-in theater. The massive screen reflected what little light remained, casting a pale glow across cracked asphalt. We used it like a wall. I set up the last floodlight and rationed its battery. They didn't come that night. Not infected. Not humans. Just wind and distant thunder. In the morning, Ava was burning with fever. It wasn't a bite. I checked every inch of her skin. No marks. No wounds. Just heat and shivering. Probably dehydration. Maybe altitude sickness catching up late. Maybe something else. I gave her water and the last electrolyte packet. She slept while I sat with my back against the screen tower, watching shadows crawl across the ground. This is how it ends for most people now. Not with screams. With someone sitting quietly beside them, hoping the sun holds. By afternoon, Ava's fever broke. She asked for crackers. I almost cried. We kept moving. We crossed into rolling prairie dotted with abandoned windmills and skeletal barns. Crows picked through what was left of livestock. The roads were empty. Every few miles, we passed signs of people who hadn't made it. Shoes, backpacks, handwritten notes taped to fences. I recorded everything. Not for broadcast, for memory. The infected population below the mountains is collapsing fast. Bodies are everywhere, but so are human graves. Whatever comes next won't look like the world we lost. It will be smaller, quieter, built from scraps and hard lessons. Ava walks beside me, humming to herself. Her shadow stretches long across the road. I keep her in the light, always. The clouds caught us just after midday. Not thick storm cover, just enough to dull the sun and soften the edges of everything. The kind of sky that makes shadows wider and less predictable. I felt it immediately. So did Ava. She stopped walking and looked up. Is it getting darker? Just for a little while, I told her. We didn't slow down. The prairie gave way to low hills and broken fencing. An overturned school bus lay on its side near a dry creek bed. Windows punched out from the inside. Someone had stacked stones in a careful circle beside it. Inside the circle were 6 small crosses made from snapped branches. I didn't explain what they were. Ava already knew. By late afternoon, we reached a farmhouse with most of its roof gone. The walls still stood, and the interior was open to the sky. Sunlight poured through the collapse in wide columns. It was safe enough for a short rest. I scavenged canned beans and a box of matches from the pantry. Ava sat in the light and drew in the dirt with a stick. She drew a road. She drew 2 people walking. She drew a sun that took up half the sky. We stayed until the light began to slant. Then we moved again. There was no dramatic final chase. No last stand. No moment where everything crystallized into something meaningful. That's not how this ends. We walked through fields of dead wheat and past irrigation pivots frozen mid-turn. We passed a town where every door was open and every window was broken. Someone had dragged mannequins into the street and dressed them in coats, trying to make it look occupied. It hadn't worked. The infected here were almost all down, collapsed in alleys, curled beneath porches. Some were already decomposing where they fell. The parasite had finally run out of energy, but the quiet felt wrong. Too large, too permanent. We encountered one living person that evening. An older man sitting in a lawn chair under a portable solar lamp. He waved when he saw us. He said his name was Richard. He said his wife had died 3 days earlier from exposure. He said he was waiting for morning because he didn't want to walk in the dark. I offered him water. He thanked me. He didn't ask to come with us. Some people are finished before their bodies stop. We left him there. That night we slept in the open, wrapped in blankets under a sky full of stars. No infected came. No gunfire echoed in the distance. Just wind in the grass. Ava curled against me and asked if we were safe now. I told her safer than before. She accepted that. In the morning, frost coated the ground. My boots crunched as we walked. Her breath made little clouds. We reached the edge of a small town just after sunrise. A water tower leaned at an angle. A grocery store had collapsed inward. A handwritten sign on the library door said books are free now. We went inside. We took one children's book and a map. That's all. We found a community garden behind a church where someone had planted winter kale. We ate it raw in the sunlight. Ava laughed because it tasted bitter. That sound felt fragile. The infected are mostly gone now. Not completely. There are still stragglers in deep shadows and underground spaces. But the massive waves are over. The parasite burned itself out just like the models said it would. Took almost everyone with it. There are survivor pockets scattered across continents. High ground, remote farmland, islands with enough sun and enough discipline. They won't rebuild cities. They won't restore grids. They'll grow food. They'll teach their children where shadows fall. They'll tell stories about how the world used to work. Humanity didn't win. It endured. Barely. I don't know how long Ava and I will last. I don't know if we'll reach the place with wind power and wells. I don't know if winter will finish what the parasite started. I only know that every morning I wake up and check the sky. And every day I keep her in the light. This didn't come from monsters. It came from laboratories and contracts and quiet approvals. It came from people who believed progress mattered more than restraint. There was no cure. There was no heroic reversal. Just cells consuming cells until the system collapsed. Ava is walking ahead of me now, carrying the book under one arm. She stops every so often to make sure I'm still there. I always am. The sun is low. We're heading toward a line of trees that opens into another stretch of open ground. I'm recording this on the last working device I have. The battery indicator is flashing. If this is the final entry anyone ever hears, let it be simple. We were not undone by myth. We were undone by ourselves. And what survives will be quieter, smaller, built from memory and sunlight. Ava just turned around and waved at me. I waved back. Then I turned off the recorder. We're walking into the evening.